And now we get to hear another great speaker. I'm going to get to introduce him. It says here in my notes, as soon to be senior senator from Missouri, Roy Blunt. I have to tell you, that has a nice ring to it, senior senator Roy Blunt. And I know that Roy is pleased about that as well. Near the end of each congressional session, the American Farm Bureau Federation partners with state farm bureaus to recognize members of Congress who have outstanding voting records and good relationships with members and staff. Time and time again, Roy has stood shoulder to shoulder with Farm Bureau members across the state in fighting regulatory overreach, advocating for common sense legislative solutions that are critical to the agriculture industry and the rural way of life. Roy has a long-standing relationship with Missouri Farm Bureau, and this morning we are pleased to present him with the Friend of Farm Bureau Award for the American Farm Bureau Federation. This award recognizes his exemplary record in supporting Farm Bureau's efforts and our great partnership over the years. Senator Blunt is receiving this award for the 11th time this morning. Please join me in congratulating and welcoming Senator Roy Blunt. Sir?
Thanks, buddy.
I'll carry it on.
Well, thank you, Blake, and I'm grateful to be here. I noticed the theme was gratitude, and you'd have a hard time finding somebody who has more reason to be grateful than me. My opportunities because of you have exceeded in so many ways anything that I'd have had any reason to believe I'd get to be part of in my life. But one of my opportunities has been the long relationship we've had, the ability to call on your leaders, your elected leaders, your president, your vice president, the board, but all of you individually that we work with, and all of the feedback that we have on our team that's out there in the state all the time. So thank you for that. I'm grateful for Governor Parson. Mike Parson, when I became the president of Southwest Baptist University in January of 1993, it was the same week Mike Parson became the sheriff of Polk County. And I don't care how good they are, if you've got 3,500 students on a college campus, the two people you get to know the best are the chief of police and the county sheriff. And he and I have been good friends all that time. And the very fact that when they had to tell him it was probably better be thinking about coming to Jefferson City, he was about to become the next governor, that he was baling hay, that's a good sign too. And so I am grateful for him and grateful that he's going to be a great leader for our state. Mike Kehoe, the new lieutenant governor, a great partner in those efforts. Both of those people understand agriculture and understand how important it is to Missouri. Let me mention another thing. You know, we have this weekend, people were grateful for President Bush. A guy who led a great life of public service. His mother was a Missourian, Dorothy Walker. So as a matter of fact, I saw one clip the other day when asked by his granddaughter Jenna, when you go to heaven, who are you going to look for first? And he said, well, if Barbara's there, I'll look for her first. But that was a few years ago. So if Barbara's there, I'll look for her first. But then I'll look for my mom. And moms make a difference, and she had those values that you and I understand, the values of, he was in so many ways such a great example of his generation who, the stand up straight, take responsibility, share credit, take blame, the kinds of things that everybody in this room understands. I'm the chairman of the Rules Committee, which you'll remember is why I got to be the chair of the inauguration last time and be able to be there as President Trump was sworn in. But I'll be there this evening when, because of that job, when President Bush's body comes to lay in state in the rotunda of the Capitol for 36 hours before his memorial service on Thursday. But he's a great man, and he understood public service, and I'm grateful for him as well. I was grateful to be able to be there the day President Trump was sworn in. And the regulatory environment, these out-of-control regulators that we saw under the 8 years of the Obama administration, that's changed 180 degrees. You know, it's often hard to remember the things that didn't happen. But the things that were about to happen, the waters of the U.S., you know, I had that Farm Bureau map on the floor of the United States Senate dozens of times. We've got to where we just kept it in the cloakroom. Every time this bill came up, and it came up, everything this regulation would need to be talked about, and it was, by the way, it needed to be talked about a lot. I'd take that Farm Bureau map that had the part of the state that would be covered by EPA control on anything involving water, resurfacing your driveway, putting a sidewalk in front of your house, drilling a utility pole, maybe what you could put on your field, because, you know, the EPA had decided that navigable water meant basically all the water. Any water that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water, that could run into navigable water. That was where the EPA was going to be in charge. Every building permit. Who knows what they would have expanded that to? And in our state, that Farm Bureau map, I think it was 99.7% of Missouri would have been under the control of the EPA for whatever the EPA would have decided they needed to control. Well, thank God that didn't happen. If you were going to slow down our economy, that may have been the very first way in our state you could have done it. Or the power rule that would have, the so-called clean power rule, that in our state would have doubled the average utility bill in 10 or 12 years. And by the way, the average rural utility bill would have more than doubled and quicker than that, because it was that war on coal that didn't anticipate what impact we were going to have. So those regulatory things, that 180-degree change in regulation, probably the biggest single economic benefit of the last 2 years. Certainly the biggest single short-term benefit to our economy of the last 2 years. The biggest long-term benefit may be judges. And everybody watched the ridiculous effort to try to stop Judge Kavanaugh from going on the court. But judges, and judges that serve for life. And so I can guarantee you that we're looking for judges who believe in the Constitution and believe the Constitution and the law should be interpreted based on what they say rather than what the judge thinks they should say. That's one criteria. The second criteria is as young as possible and as healthy as possible. You know, on the Supreme Court, the two judges that we put on the Supreme Court in the last 2 years replaced judges that were on the Supreme Court for 30 years. 30 years. Both nominated by Ronald Reagan. Both served for almost 30 years. It was fairly late when they were both nominated. Both served for almost 30 years after he left the White House. One of them served for 28 years after Reagan died, and the other one left the White House. One of them served 13 years after Reagan died, and the other one served 15 years after Reagan died. Talk about long-term impact of judges that will decide what, again, the Constitution and the law say. And 1/6 of all the next level of judges, the Court of Appeals judges, have now been nominated by Donald Trump and confirmed by the current Senate. And having 53 Republican senators, and thank you for that. Thank you for our part of that. Thank you for having 53 Republican senators will make a big difference as opposed to 51. Right now, any one or two Republicans, and we come from lots of different places all over the country, can decide. They get more leverage. Everybody has more leverage than they need. And 53 dramatically changes that leverage. We would have confirmed, we could be confirming more judges right now if there were 53 people there right now, and we're going to see that happen. And so, you know, the tax bill, there are lots of good medium-term things that are going to have impact. The governor mentioned trade. I'm encouraged by what I saw happen this weekend in Argentina, the signing of the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement. I'll be more encouraged when that agreement is approved. Certainly took longer than I wished it had to get there, but we are there. It's important to us. Our state would be the 5th most negatively impacted of all 50 states if NAFTA just went away. We have benefited from figuring out how to make that two-way ability to compete work in our state. And China, I think I said on Fox News yesterday with Chris Wallace that China has totally stopped buying products that really matter where we live. The soybean exports have gone 98% lower than they were 2 years ago, and I think the 2% just got through by accident. And whether it's soybeans or pork or beef or chicken or other commodities, we need that market. But of all the fights we could be in, that's the fight where the Chinese take more advantage of us than anybody else does. And so hopefully as we fight that fight and the Chinese realize we're serious about it, we'll also get serious about finishing our agreements with Japan and finishing our agreements with the EU, and be sure we pass this NAFTA agreement and bring the world together in the fight of the bad actors in trade rather than think that trade's bad. Trade's not bad. We can compete with anybody, and we need to be thinking about how we compete with anybody. I supported the Proposition D. Now, I'm not a big tax guy, and there have been very few taxes that I've ever supported, but obviously we didn't make the case. Farm Bureau supported Proposition D too. Our biggest single advantage is location. Where we live, we've got lots of advantages. We've got great workforce, we've got great work ethic, we've got a heritage that the governor talked about earlier, but our biggest single advantage over the people we compete with is location. We just happen to be where the rivers and the railroads and the interstate highways come together, and we need to decide if we're going to take maximum advantage of that or not. World grain price, for instance, is world grain price less what it cost you to get it there. And we need to be thinking about that. Now, we've got this challenge. It's been an unbelievably challenging year for most farm families where we live. The opportunity out there, though, is pretty great. World food demand is going to double between now and 2050. As I worry about losing markets, I worry a little less than I would if it wasn't for that one fact, because the market is going to grow so fast that we ought to be thinking about how we're competing a couple of years from now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. If the biggest part of the biggest part of the economy on any given day, which is food, if that's twice as big in 2050, 32 years from now, as it is today, it would take some cataclysmic thing for that not to happen. The term I use, world food demand, will double by 2050, we think. Once you get the better food, people really don't want the not so good food again. Once you get the more food choices, people want to continue to get the more food choices. But if the economy even doesn't support those opportunities, world food need doubles by 2060. By 2060, there'll just be twice as many people as there are right now, and we need to be thinking about how we take advantage of our great opportunities in that kind of environment. We can't over-regulate, we can't overtax, we can't fail to be prepared for the opportunities that are out there. I think people want to bring manufacturing jobs back to America again for the national security reasons that we offer, the rule of law that we offer. But if you're going to bring a manufacturing job to America today, the first two questions you would ask yourself would be, can you pay the utility bill and do what we want to do? And does the transportation system work for what we want to do? And think about the logic of that. If the answer to either of those questions is no, obviously there's no reason to think about any other question. There's no reason to think about quality of workforce. There's no reason to think about locating your facility where people would want to live, so you don't have to constantly retrain people to do the jobs today that take more training than others did. So we want to be sure. That's why it's so important to fight for competitive utility rates, not just for families, number one priority, but for jobs, a very close number two priority, and then making that transportation network work. And frankly, we do better in an economy where people are growing things and making things. We are a productive economy. Those of us who live in the middle of the country, now we can give pretty good advice, but it's just not our strong suit. And we have people that give good advice and create good opportunities in that service-oriented economy. But where we're really good is when we're producing something. And we need to be thinking about how we combine those jobs where people grow things and those jobs where people make things. And I've talked to a couple of people this morning just reminding me again something we all understand where we live takes a lot of off-farm opportunities to create the on-farm opportunities in a state that has the most farms of, I believe still, of any state in the country, but they logically wouldn't be as big as the farms in some other places. And sometimes they have to be supplemented by that growing economy that produces opportunities. And healthcare. Let me say something about that. Two things just to think about on healthcare. And Blake Hurst, by the way, has been a close personal friend of mine for a long time. We talk a lot. He is a great leader. He's a thoughtful guy. And I asked him last week, okay, what are we able to do with this idea of associated health plans? It's something I've been for years, where if you have a restaurant and you have 12 or 15 employees, obviously you're better off if you get insurance with a bigger group than your group. And the Trump administration's figured out how to do that. I'm not sure it quite meets the traditional farm family definition yet, but getting your insurance in groups, that's in place now. I was asking the Secretary of Labor one day last week how this was going. He said they'd had in their most recent rollout in Nevada, they'd had 680 companies in Las Vegas that went to a Las Vegas conference. They're getting their insurance now through a bigger group than they had a chance to be for before, and the average reduction in cost was 30%. You know, I've told some of you this before, but after World War II, the way we get our insurance in America is it grew up uniquely and unintentionally. The wage and price, President Truman put wage and price controls in place to try to keep the economy from overheating, and the wage and to try to compete for the best employees, people coming back into that workforce from the military and other ways. People said, well, we can't give you more money, but we'll give insurance. Nobody had really ever gotten insurance at work to speak of before 1946. We'll give insurance. So they check with the wage and price control person and say, if we give insurance, does that violate the wage increase cap? No, you can get insurance and it won't count against wages. So then they asked the IRS person, well, if it doesn't count against wages, should it be taxable? And the IRS person said, no, it won't be taxable. So that's why we have the system we have. And people began to negotiate and look for and offer insurance, which didn't cost much at all in 1946, but it was a non-taxable benefit that you got as a group. Now, what we're trying to do right now is figure out how to create more ways for more people to get in bigger groups. And that includes, obviously, farm families. And Blake and I have talked about that. And there are a couple of challenges there, but they're not necessarily the challenge for the business that somebody at your house works in that maybe has been a little too small to have insurance before, but allows your family to get insurance that way. And the other thing is the health plans that are the short-term health plans, short-term now meaning up to 3 years, that don't cover everything Obama covered, But what Obamacare covered, but what Americans found out in many cases is you couldn't afford to have the coverage that Obamacare covered. And if you had the coverage, it had such a big deductible, it was like you had no coverage at all. So these short-term health plans that can get you maybe from 62 to 65 and Medicare, wherever, whatever, or from one job to the next, those are plans you can shop for that have what you think you need and what you can afford. I know that offends a lot of so-called progressives in America today, that you could have what you need and what you afford, but we're trying to allow that as an option. Obviously, pre-existing conditions, people are concerned about that. Anybody that has a pre-existing condition has the entire affordable health care network they can go to if they've got that, and other ways to cover pre-existing conditions other places. One other thing I'll mention there, because it came out of my conversation with the Secretary of Labor, they're about to put out rules where you could also have associated retirement plans, to where you could take your 401k or be part of a 401k that was part of a much bigger group. And, you know, rather than your IRA that you try to figure out how you're going to invest that money, you do that in a bigger group way. And if you're in a group that has $1 billion to invest, it costs about 0.25% of your money to be part of that group. If you're in a group that has $10 million to invest, it takes about 1.25% of your money every year to be part of that group. And that, so you know, there are things we're trying to do to encourage people who are entrepreneurs, to encourage people who are farmers and farm families to be able to have the same kind of access to benefits in that world that other people have as part of a different kind of economy. But an economy that grows things and makes things is great for us. We have every reason to believe that in that economy, the middle of the country always does better, and it's pretty hard to get closer to the middle of the country than we are. Pretty hard to get closer to the values that this country was built on than Farm Bureau represents and your families represent. And I am grateful every day in the United States Senate to get to represent you. Thanks for letting me come today. Thank you all.